chat. Varsity, cool. Okay, so we got a varsity person, we got some JV people. So we're just gonna do a basic overview. And then we will get into questions slash like workshopy stuff. These I'm planning to have one tomorrow and Friday also. The one tomorrow will be for general critiques, so stuff like the capitalism critique, settler colonialism, Afro-pessimism, queer theory, stuff that tends to come up every season. And then the one on Friday will be for things that are more topic specific. So critiques like ecofeminism, eco-managerialism, whatever hodgepodge critique was put into your file for JV and varsity. So yeah, these are not going to be like lectures. They're going to be workshops where it's like we'll do a short intro, go over some basics, and then we will get into any questions that you have. So let's talk about theory. So we're going to cover in this like short section, we're going to go over general theory stuff, was just sort of miscellaneous, counterplan theory, critique theory, permutation theory, and fiat, which is sort of another theory-ish thing. So that's what we're going to cover. For the person who just got here, we're just going to cover some basics, and then we're going to get into questions, answers, and discussions. So this was my sad attempt to put a meme in my presentation, but theory is a powerful tool. You need to be sure that you're using it for the right purposes. And you need to be sure you're picking the right theory to do what you want to do. Sorry, one sec. Okay. So here are some general types of theory. We got disclosure theory, which is sort of like a pretty big but miscellaneous one. Disclosure theory is the theory that covers, okay, well, so first, sorry, getting into the weeds too quickly. What do we mean by theory in a debate? Does somebody from varsity who has encountered theory before want to tell me just real quick, like, what do we mean when we're talking about theory? Not in terms of critiques, just in terms of like theory arguments in debate. Nope, that's okay. Theory is a lot to wrap your head around. So theory arguments are just arguments that are sort of the metagame of debate, basically. They're arguments that pertain to debate theory itself. So what should have a role in debate? What arguments should and shouldn't be legitimate in debate? What practices should and shouldn't be legitimate in debate? So this is why we get in general theory stuff like disclosure theory, which is arguments that people will make sometimes that affirmative should disclose what affirmative they're reading in the round, or that negative should disclose what their past 2 and R's are before going into a round. This in general is just a pretty common practice. If you refuse to disclose to another team, they'll usually read some form of disclosure theory and just say that that makes for bad debates because it makes it harder for a negative to prepare a decent strategy. It means that you're just kind of trying to like pull one over on them rather than actually having a decent debate. And then there's also misdisclosure theory, which is not so much a theory as it is a big yikes thing that can get you disqualified from a tournament. So that is one where you need to be really careful that what you're talking about is actually like what happened, and that it is something that you actually like want to do, because then it becomes a whole issue. I accidentally argued disclosure theory against a team that actually misdisclosed to me before a round once, and it turned into a whole mess. So that is something that you don't want to do unless you actually know what you're getting yourself into. So then there's other more trivial miscellaneous theory things. There's ASPEC, which is agent specification, which is an argument that says that you should specify an agent that you're acting through in your plan text. You can't just say the United States federal government should. You should specify the Congress or the judiciary system or whatever. And then OSPEC is sort of a joke argument that is over specification, which says that you shouldn't specify specifically what you're acting through. That's mostly a meme, but if it comes up, that's what it means. Vagueness is an argument that'll get made a lot, that'll say that you should be more specific in your debate arguments. This comes up in a bunch of different contexts. Sometimes it'll be that you think their plan mechanism is too vague. They should specify like what legislation they're acting through. Or in critiques, you'll hear like vague alts a lot, which is saying that the alternative to the critique is too vague and a team needs to specify exactly what actions they're taking. And then you just have other like random theory arguments like politics disad theory, where you say politics disads are illegitimate because they end up just becoming like a big discussion about like different political analyst projections that don't actually get you anywhere. It's just like how recent was the evidence that you cut. And it just devolves from actually talking about the topic to just talking about the same piece of legislation that may or may not pass in the future, rather than actually what you're supposed to be going into the debate to debate about. So this kind of makes sense how all of these are about what is or isn't appropriate to read in a debate round, what should or shouldn't have a place within debate. We got no cameras on, so I'm gonna need like a thumbs up or a yes in the chat or something. Okay, cool. So if there's any questions at any point, feel free to share them in the chat. Like I said, this is not a lecture. This is more of a discussion jumping off point. So theory is just debate metagame. I tried to find a metagaming meme. All of them are about D&D and very niche. So we're going to start with counterplan theory. We're going to go over this really quick because all of you should at some point have a lecture about counterplan theory, and I don't want to step on any toes. But the idea of a counterplan, this is the Wikipedia definition, since it's been a long time since I ran a counterplan. The counterplan must be superior and not equal to both the plan and any possible combination of the plan and the counterplan, which means that the burden of proof for a counterplan is pretty specific in that the counterplan just has to prove that it's better than the plan and the counterplan. So it's got to be better than the plan and the permutation. Better than is a pretty low bar. And so there's a lot of rules in sort of debate theory world about what is or isn't a legitimate counterplan, because that as a bar for an argument is outrageous. You could have a counterplan that's like, okay, counterplan, do the plan, and give everybody in the US $1,000. And that would be pretty easy to argue that that's better than the plan. It's something that the AF probably isn't prepared to defend against. And it would be completely unreasonable to read as a counterplan. So we're going to talk real quick about why. So there are types of counterplans. There's an advantage counterplan, not very controversial, pretty standard counterplan. It just does one of the advantages in a different way. This still meets the burden of proof for a counterplan because the counterplan is still, with changing one of those advantages, going to be better than doing the plan because you will have a net benefit that is a disad to whichever advantage you change. So in that case, even if you do the plan and the changed advantage, since you still have to do the plan, you're still bringing along that disadvantage with it. So as long as you win the disadvantage, you win that your way of doing that advantage is better. So advantage counterplan is just targeting one advantage specifically and saying, hey, we could do that better. The mechanism / process counterplan, also not super controversial. It's a counterplan that just says that the mechanism that you do the plan by is not great. Like if you're targeting one piece of legislation, they say, hey, this other piece of legislation would be a much more effective way to do that. It's generally one of the more common types of counterplan, especially in years when the state's counterplan is not going to be a big deal. State's counterplan is a type of actor counterplan. There's other types of actor counterplans. There can be private sector counterplans. There can be, oh, we should get the NATO to do it. We should get the United Nations to do it, whatever. All of these actor counterplans are basically just do the plan, but have somebody else do it. These, very controversial. Mostly the state's counterplan is controversial because I think you will go over it in much greater detail or have already gone over in much greater detail. basically saying that the states should do something is doing a lot more legwork with that should than saying the federal government should do something, because the federal government at the very least is just one entity, while the states are 50 different entities, and they all have very different opinions on how to do things, and getting them all to act on the same piece of legislation or the same plan in the same way at the same time would be virtually impossible. So a lot of people will argue that states' counterplans are illegitimate because they demand that you fiat or just like pretend that the states would all be able to enact this plan or would willingly enact this plan, when that's very unlikely to ever be the case. So basically, it's saying that that's an unreasonable thing to suppose, because it would never happen, and therefore you should ground the debate in like actual alternatives to the plan rather than this like fantasy one that you just made up about how all the states should do it instead. Um, Consult counterplans are another type of counterplan that comes up occasionally. These are pretty sketchy counterplans because they're basically do the plan but ask somebody else about it first. The net benefit to this will always be like, oh, we should ask, I don't know, China about the plan because they'll get angry if we don't. And you know, they'll dig up some person who's written about this on the internet about how we should probably consult China about XYZ thing. And they're very suspect because it's basically just stealing the plan and saying, hey, let's just ask China about it and that'll make everything better and avoid some war. That's probably not ever going to happen, anyways. So, consult counterplans, also very susceptible to counterplan theory and people just saying, hey, that's unreasonable. That shouldn't happen in debate because you could literally just find any blogger who's written, hey, we should consult Czechoslovakia about this. Czechoslovakia doesn't exist, but I'm sure you could find a blogger who says that we should consult them about any random issue because the internet is the internet and you can find anything. PICs are plan inclusive counterplans. These are counterplans that are also very controversial, less sketchy than the consult counterplan. But these are counterplans that basically take the plan and change one thing about it. So it'll be like, hey, we should do the plan minus in Alaska. And then they'll have like some piece of evidence about how banning fracking or regulating fracking more in Alaska would be bad because that's where all the fracking industry likes to like get most of their oil and it doesn't do a huge amount of damage to the environment there, and yada yada yada. So picks are basically something that is basically the plan but changes a tiny little thing, so that the plan text is not exactly the same, even though the actual action of the plan is largely the same. You just find one thing that you're going to pick out of, and find a disadvantage to that one component of the plan. Picks, there's a lot of theory about because people will say, hey, you shouldn't do a pick. You're just stealing the plan and nitpicking one thing out, that you found a piece of evidence that, you know, leaving out that one thing would make the plan easier, better, or whatever. But the negative will argue back, hey, you chose your plan text. You should have, like, you know, very carefully considered every word of your plan text and made sure that there was nothing we could pick out of. So this is, you know, something that's there's going to be a lot of debate over if you run any of these types of counterplans, but there's also ways to argue back against them. That's just some of the counterplan theory that's out there. So the types of theories for counterplans are conditionality, conditionality theory, condo, very big, gonna happen on pretty much every counterplan debate unless you run it unconditionally, which very rarely happens. How familiar, can I get some thumbs up or either on the screen or in the chat about how familiar people are with conditionality or unfamiliar they are? Thumbs up, thumbs down. We gotta check. Do we have a thumbs up, thumbs down from other people? Mainly unfamiliar. Okay, cool. So we'll go over conditionality really quick. Conditionality is what we call the status of the counterplan. It basically means under what conditions can you just basically jettison the counterplan? Because if you think about it, you can't just jettison your plan right in the middle of the debate if you're like, hey, this plan is not going very well. I'm just gonna like get rid of it and start another plan in the middle of the debate. That's not gonna fly. So the affirmative basically will argue that if the negative runs a counter plan, if they have a counter proposal that they're arguing, they should not be able to jettison it in the middle of the debate and make all of the affirmative's work arguing against it go to waste. This is not a very popular stance because counterplans are widely accepted as part of a debate, and getting rid of counterplans in the middle of the debate, if you decide to go for a disad or go for topicality or whatever, is also mainly accepted in debate. When this gets tricky is when you have like 2 or 3 or 4 counterplans and they're all conditional and they all say different things. And you're making the affirmative respond to all of them, and then you're saying, oh yeah, and I'm going to get rid of 2 of these, right after the 1AR. That's not very fair to the affirmative. It puts a huge burden on them to answer a bunch of stuff that you're not actually seriously considering as an alternative to the plan. And so that's where conditionality theory comes in, where you'll argue, hey, this is not okay, especially if you have more than one type of off case, like you have a counter plan, you have a critique, you have another counter plan, all of that jazz, and any of those can be conditional. That shouldn't be allowed. You should have to have one conditional argument or maybe 2 conditional arguments, but no more than that. So setting that type of boundary and arguing that it's wrong to have conditionality beyond just like, one off case position is a fairly reasonable argument that a lot of people will make. People also argue conditionality is just bad in general because it allows that sort of thing of people running like 5 different counter plans and then making you answer all of them and then jettisoning them once they've wasted your time. So that's a fairly good argument in terms of why conditionality is bad. You should always ask if somebody's reading a counter plan against you. You should ask after the 1 and C whether the counterplan is conditional or unconditional. And if they say something like, oh, it's dispositional, then in that case, that basically just means it's conditional and you need to ask them under what circumstances will you kick your counterplan. And then you make the same arguments you would make about conditionality, that if there's circumstances under which they can kick their counterplan, that's not a good way to do debate. Does that make sense about why you need to not only think about in that particular debate round why it's a bad idea, but also what it allows in other debates and why we should sort of like be cultivating norms in debate for what does or doesn't make a good debate? Any questions? Okay, cool. Nice. So next thing is we went over the types of counterplans being bad. Next thing is permutation theory, which we will get to on a whole separate thing because permutations also apply to critiques. So here we go. Done with counterplans, moving on. Critique theory. Okay, so critique theory, there's actually not that many different things because most critiques, there's not specific theory to go along with different types of critiques. There's just general K theory. So the first thing, the easiest to deal with probably is vague alts, which is where people will say that the alternative to your critique is vague. This is the easiest way to get around this is by not having a vague alt. If you can point specifically to what your critique says the AF should do instead of whatever they did wrong, then there's no real reason for people to read vague alts. They probably will anyways because people who read vague alts just love to read it. But then you can argue, hey, our card literally says that this XYZ is the exact steps you should take, and it's not vague at all. If you do have a vague alt, then you need to be prepared to defend it. Why is your alt vague? If you have something like a really popular one on like the capitalism critique is historical materialism, which basically means that you need to base your understanding of history on a materialist analysis, which is an analysis of how to phrase this. It's an analysis of history through the eye of like labor and material rights and stuff like that. So rather than looking at history as like, oh, such and such conquered such and that's why we have such and such country, looking at it instead through, oh, like this was the state of labor in this century. This is how people in the working class were treated. This is why they revolted at this period. This is how they once again became oppressed under a new class that rose up, stuff like this. And so people will say that do a historical materialist analysis is vague. But if you can explain, like, okay, this is what a historical materialist analysis of your affirmative would look like, then it's not as vague anymore. So the best way to defend against vague alts is by proving why it isn't vague, because it is true that it's unreasonable to expect somebody to argue against something that you haven't specified, and that's just kind of this vague cloud of like, I don't know, we should change something. But you need to make sure that you're able to explain it and why it's not vague, because it is unfair for somebody to have to argue against something that's really nebulous and changes a lot. Permutation theory, also a big deal with K's. We'll get to that in the next bit. And the big boogeyman of K's, framework. Hopefully you will, have any of you had the K lecture yet, or is that all happening tomorrow? Have a thumbs up if you've had the K lecture. Nope. Okay. So I'm gonna assume none of you have had the, oh yes, somebody has had the K lecture. Okay, cool. So as far as framework goes, or the critique, thinking of framework as a type of theory is probably the most common way to think about it in debate, which is funny because most K debaters will not think of framework as theory. They'll think of it as part of a critique. But I think that theory is actually the most accurate way to think of framework, because framework is talking about within a debate round, you're laying out a literal framework for the judge of how they should evaluate the debate. Like, what is the rubric on which you should evaluate this debate? And so a lot of people will think that framework is an affirmative argument of, oh, you shouldn't just discount our affirmative because the critique is criticizing some parts of it. You should evaluate the good that our affirmative could do against the potential damage of the critique. But that's how most judges would evaluate around anyways. So that's really a more defensive stance on framework. The real framework comes into play when critique teams talk about why they should be allowed to keep their critique in the debate and why it should be evaluated before any other aspect of the debate. If you argue framework well, you can argue that your critique should be evaluated before, like, I mean, I don't know why you would want to argue that it would be evaluated before topicality, since both of them are negative arguments, but you can argue that it should be evaluated before any other type of argument in the round. And the reason for that is that you can pull on the theory aspects of framework and say, okay, debate as an activity is an educational activity, and we are criticizing some part of the research and education that the affirmative is providing, whether that is we're criticizing their epistemology or the way that they come to arrive at their understanding of the affirmative, or we're criticizing maybe their approach towards the environment, we're criticizing the way that they depend on capitalist systems, any of this stuff, you're saying, okay, if we can prove that that is a bad model of understanding the world, then you should reject their affirmative, because you should not consider you should first consider that the education we are providing in debate is a good education and that this is a good model for us to learn under. If you just accept affirmatives that we have proved are researched under bad understandings, then we aren't gaining a good education through debate because we're starting from the wrong premise. Does that make sense? So the reason we use framework in critique debates is as sort of theory to defend the purpose of a critique in debate. Could I get a thumbs up or a thumbs down on that? Maybe processing questions? Oop. Yes, framework is trying to lay out for the judge why the case should be the most important thing in the round for them. Oh my goodness, I completely lost my, haha. Okay, I did actually have a whole slide about framework, so let's see if this helps clear things up as well. Yeah, framework is trying to argue why the judge should evaluate the critique first. And if you're affirmative, arguing against framework is trying to argue that the judge should not evaluate the critique first, and should instead weigh the AF against the critique. The critique is just saying, no, forget about the app's impacts. If you can't trust any of the apps that you research anyways, then why are we even talking about the impacts if this isn't even a good way for us to be starting this debate as people within this round in the real world? So framework is a form of the metagame. It's keeping in mind not just for the imaginary world that you're debating about, but for your real world that you are in a debate round within. What is fair, what is educational, and what is important to include in debate? If you exclude critiques from debate, then what stops somebody from reading an AF that is maybe incredibly racist, but that does technically fulfill all of the debate requirements of having an inherency, harms, and a solvency, and that can defend itself against disads, or that there's no real disads too, because nobody really takes it seriously because it's such a ridiculously racist argument. What do you do in that situation? If the critique is not evaluated before the AF, then you have no way to argue that rejecting somebody on the basis of them making a really racist argument, and it's something that should be an educational activity, should come before whatever imaginary racist world that they've set up within the AF. You need to argue that the real world should come before any supposed world that the AF is proposing. Does that make sense why that is a negative argument, and why that argument supports like the practice of evaluating critiques first in a debate round? Okay, cool. So yeah, on the affirmative, of course, you're gonna argue against framework. You can just say, hey, like, obviously it's a good idea to have critiques in debate, but you should still weigh the affirmative. And they should still have a high burden of proof that the affirmative does actually do what they're criticizing it about. And that's where the theory debate comes in. Should you, as the affirmative, have to be worried that you may have somehow subtly included some implicit bias against, like, I don't know, centering humans in your thought processes rather than animals, so that they run an anthropocentrism critique against you and you get rejected for putting humans first? Like, should that be something that you have to worry about in your 1AC, or can you just write an AF and be able to debate it on its merits? So there are two sides to every argument. Well, not necessarily. There are some arguments that don't have two sides. There are two sides to every argument in debate. And there's definitely a balance that has to be struck on framework, just like any other theory argument. Okay, last stop, oh shoot, not the last stop, almost the last stop, permutation theory. Two types of permutation theory that are the main ones that'll come up. Permutations, if we remember, are a way to test the competition of a negative off-case position. So you will run them with either a counterplan or a critique. With a counterplan, it's just saying do the plan and the counterplan. If you can do both the plan and the counterplan, then that proves that the counterplan is not a reason to reject doing the plan, since you could just do that at another period of time, or just do them at the same time, and then it solves their problems. Or you could run a permutation on a critique and say, hey, do the plan and do the critique. There's no reason why you can't do both. Saying you can do both means that it's not a reason to reject the AF. So that's why you read permutations. The negative will argue two things against permutations generally that are theory-based arguments. They'll have plenty of other like logic-based arguments, but theory-wise, there are two types of permutation that they'll say are illegitimate. The first is severance permutations. These are permutations that sever part of the plan or the 1AC, meaning that they fail to prove that they are actually mutually exclusive. Which means, meaning I wrote this wrong. It means that it fails to prove that you can do them together. Because if you're cutting off part of the plan in order to do them together, then that means that you can't actually do the full plan and the counter plan or the critique. So an example of this would be do one advantage of the plan and the advantage counter plan for the other advantage. Obviously, if you're cutting off a whole advantage, then you are severing out of part of your 1AC. That's not good, and means that you couldn't do the plan and the counter plan. Doing the plan minus like whatever language that you use that they're criticizing in a language case. So like, let's say you do the plan, but I'd abandon an anthropocentric mindset and do the anthropocentrism K. That is arguably severing out of the language that you initially used in the 1AC, and therefore is grounds for an argument about severance permutations. Severance perms are bad because they mean that you are not actually proving that you can do both. People will argue this is the type of theory because they'll say that that is an attempt to sort of break the rules of debate, and that's a reason that you should like reject the team or whatever. But that's just an exaggeration. The most that people will ever do because of a severance permutation is reject the permutation itself and just say, okay, that's not a workable permutation. And intrinsicness permutations are permutations that add to the plan in order to do all or part of the counterplan or the critique. So an example would be if you're doing the state's counterplan and they try and permute it, they would do the plan and then also issue a declaration to the states that make them enact the state's counterplan as well. Issuing a declaration to the states from the federal government mandating that they do something would not be part of the original state's counterplan and therefore would be an intrinsicness perm because it adds something that was not part of the permutation not part of the arguments to begin with. People also sometimes argue that delay permutations, like do the plan and then do something else, are intrinsicness permutations because they add a time period or a waiting period that would not have existed otherwise. Does this make sense? These arguments against permutations? Thumbs up, thumbs down, questions? Okay, got one green light, so gonna call that a yes. Okay, last slide on here. Fiat. Fiat is an argument that if you wrap your head around it and you understand it really well, you will get the hang of theory arguments much faster than everyone else. So basically, one thing to keep in mind is that nothing in debate is real. Fiat is how the plan is enacted. Fiat is Latin for let it be. It's basically just the should in that plan text. It's a hypothetical world in which the plan is enacted. This is the basis for a lot of theory questions. Does the neg get fiat? How much can the neg fiat? Can the neg fiat that all 50 states do the plan? Can the neg fiat that a capitalism critique happens and that we all reject capitalism? Because that seems like it's a lot more than the affirmative is allowed to fiat. The AF can only fiat the USFG according to most AF starting points. So if the AF can only fiat the USFG, then why does the neg get to fiat more than that and counterplans or critiques or whatever? So this is our question. Fiat theory is the line between the real and the imaginary in the debate round. If you can understand that, okay, we are drawing a line between what is fiated and what should be happening in a debate round, then you will get a lot of mileage out of that. Because basically, if you exclude fiat from the conversation, if you step outside of the fiated debate and you're thinking in terms of, okay, this is a debate round. We're all here for a reason. What is that reason? Are we here to win? Are we here to learn something? What is the main benefit we get out of debate? And then do these arguments in this debate round provide us the most we can get out of debate? Do they create an activity that we all want to be a part of? That's the main question. Because of this, topicality is a type of theory. It's a bigger type of theory. It's a more mainly accepted type of theory. But what you have to understand about debate, and this is just sort of like a foundational debate, like, I don't know, this is one of those things that if you understand it about debate, the sky is the limit, right? There are no rules in debate except the rule about what speech times exist and which team is assigned to which side. Other than that, debate is just a set of norms that we all collectively construct through enacting every debate round. Every type of theory that you put out there, every round that is won or lost on a theory argument, is part of constructing that norm of practices that we all accept within debate. 50 years ago, it would be unheard of to have a planless AF in debate. But we have those regularly now because collectively, our argumentation has exceeded just, oh, if you don't stick strictly to what everybody assumes the topic means, then you lose the debate. Our arguments have advanced beyond that. And because we can argue that that has a place in debate, it does. And we've made space for that within the debate community. So fiat is the thing that bubbles in the policy debate world of, okay, this is the world in which the plan is happening. But if you step outside of that, that's where the theory arguments happen. And that's where you can get a whole lot of personalization to enter the debate. So I'm going to stop this. I will put that on the Google Drive. And also, I don't know, I'll probably drop the link somewhere sometime. Oh, I should stop. I stopped sharing, right? Escape. Yes, I did stop sharing. Great. Okay, cool. So that brings us to the end of that overview of theory. I will also pop the link to the video on the Discord so that people can see it if they missed it and they want to look it over. But does anybody have any theory arguments that you want to know more about? Any questions that you have? Any questions you have about how to do certain theory arguments? Anything, go for it.